Because Asch was what's known as a Gestalt psychologist who was interested in the influence of the entire stimulus field on perception of elements in it. And Asch argued that other people constituted part of the field against which perception was constructed. Well, here Asch turned his attention to the problem of social perception explicitly, and he argued in a famous set of phrases: ordinarily, our view of a person is highly unified. It's not too hard. If somebody calls you up and says, "What are the first three words that come to mind when you think about Barack Obama or George Bush or John McCain or John Edwards or whatever?" It's not too hard to come up with three words. It's actually hard to come up with a lot of words. And the reason it's hard to come up with a lot of words is because we really do have unified impressions of other people. He's nice. Well, what else do I say? Well, he's really nice. Well, nice most of the time. It's all nice, right? That's what Asch meant. We have a unified impression of the person. We just don't have, our impressions of people are not just lists of isolated personality traits or other kinds of words, but rather our impressions form a kind of coherent whole. Despite the fact, here we go, really nice phrase, in contrast to the unceasing movement and change in the stimulus, our perceptions of people are unified and consistent. Here we get a very interesting reference to one of the proofs of Helmholtz's constructivist approach to perception, which is that the stimulus information may change as an object moves or comes closer to us or whatever, but our perception of that object doesn't change very much. Asch noted exactly the same thing in the case of social perception. One minute you see somebody studying, the other minute you see somebody beating his dog, the next minute you see somebody kissing his girlfriend, but those are all very different kinds of things that the person does, but our impression of that person tends not to change as much as the stimulus information that's conveyed. And Asch actually tried to figure out how this happens. How do we bring the many complex stimuli that a person presents to us into some kind of coherent whole, okay? And let's just skip over this for a second. Here is a question. How do we organize the various data of observation into a single relatively unified impression? How do our impressions change with time and further experience? And what effects on our impressions do things like motives and feelings and all that have? Okay, those are the basic questions for person perception. They're the same now as they were almost 65 years ago. Okay, there are two different competing ways of thinking about impression formation. One of these is a kind of simple algebraic way of thinking about it, which is that our impression of a person is somehow the sum of his individual characteristics. If I say to you that Judy is intelligent and creative and she's a mountain climber and she enjoys playing racquetball, that's all you know about Judy, okay? And then you somehow add those up to form a coherent, unified impression. The other view, the view that Asch himself proposed, was that our impression isn't just a toting up of all these individual trait adjectives, but rather there's a unified impression. He was a Gestalt psychologist, that our impressions of people are a Gestalt, a whole that is more than simply the sum of its parts. Now, Asch didn't necessarily clinch the case for our unified impression in his work, but this is kind of where it came out of. And next time when we talk about an alternative approach to person perception, we'll show you what we mean when we talk about our impressions being the sum of a set of independent characteristics. Well, let's just get to Asch's experiments here for a second. Asch invented what's known as the impression formation paradigm. This is still the dominant way in which we study impression formation and person perception, these 60-some years later. It's a very, very, very important invention. And it's a very simple procedure. You present a list of trait adjectives that ostensibly describe some individual. I'll give you an example in a minute. And then you ask the person simply to respond. That's the stimulus. You ask the person simply to respond with their impression of that individual. This impression might take the form of a free description, a little narrative, a couple of sentences. Or it might take the form of ratings on an adjective checklist where you provide the response terms to people. Now, if you say somebody's intelligent, creative, and witty, that's the stimulus. And the checklist is intelligent, creative, and witty. That's not kind of a stupid experiment, right? You're not going to do that. The important thing is to collect the response in different terms to see what people make of the stimulus information. Okay. Here's the stimulus set, the trait ensemble for Asch's very first experiment. One group of subjects got a description that looked like the following: intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious. Okay, now just given that information, start thinking about what kind of person this might be. Okay, this is what you know. Now start thinking about your impression of that individual. The other half of the subjects got exactly the same stimulus information, except that Asch substituted here, embedded in the middle of the list, the word cold for the word warm. It's the only difference. This is the manipulation. Some people get warm, other people get cold. And then Asch asked the subjects to rate these target individuals on a set of rating scales, whether they're generous or wise or humorous or reliable or strong or altruistic or whatever. None of these are directly implied by the stimulus set, but people were able to do this. You can do this, try it for yourself. What was interesting about this is that whether targets were described as warm versus cold made a big difference in their impressions of individuals. Here, this is just the percentage of subjects endorsing each of these traits. The exact traits don't matter even if they did fit on the slide. What I want you to just notice are these huge differences between targets who were characterized as 6 traits plus warm versus targets who were characterized in terms of the same 6 traits plus 1 crummy change from warm to cold. Okay, so whether you're characterized as warm or cold makes a huge difference on more than half of the traits. Warm people are thought of as more generous, wise, happy, good-natured, humorous, altruistic, and imaginative, as opposed to cold people. So here, just one word difference between warm and cold seems to make a very big difference to the impression that we form. Fine, but now Asch repeats the experiment and he says, okay, let's just do this again. Okay, same 6 surrounding words, but now he inserts the word polite or blunt. Makes almost no difference to the impressions that people form. Yeah, there are a couple of dimensions here where there's a difference, but there's a lot more similarity than anything else. Characterizing somebody as warm or cold makes a big difference to the impression that we have of that person. Characterizing a person as polite versus blunt makes almost no difference to our impression of that individual. This was the first big finding of Asch's experiments, and it led him to postulate the existence of what he called central traits. That is, there are some traits like warm and cold that are central to the impression that we form of an individual. Central traits, qualities that, when changed, alter the entire impression of a person. Now, Asch was at pains. There was an actually earlier demonstration of this by a earlier psychologist named Thurstone, of what's known as the halo effect. Halo effect is a very well-known effect in psychology where we tend to think that good qualities go together. We tend to think of good-looking people as smart. We tend to think of intelligent people as nice. We tend to think of nice people as good-looking. All these things go together. There's a little halo around people who have socially desirable characteristics that leads us to think that they have other socially desirable characteristics as well. This isn't exactly that because it's not a matter of social desirability exactly. It's just a matter of some traits seem to have much bigger impact on our impressions than others do. Okay, and Asch himself argued. Remember, he's a Gestalt psychologist. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. The great phrase associated with Gestalt psychology. Simply changing one word out of 7 from warm to cold wouldn't necessarily make a difference. It's only 1 out of 7 words, right? It makes a big difference. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And Asch argued that a central trait, the presence of a central trait in a description of a person, changes the meaning of everything else. So that if we go back here for a second, and I say, okay, here's a person who's intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious, okay, as opposed to intelligent, skillful, industrious, cold, determined, practical, and cautious. Asch argued that the presence of warm changes what we mean by determined, changes what we mean by industrious and intelligent and skillful. Our understanding of these terms is changed by the presence of this. It's not just kind of added on. It's that Gestalt quality that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts that Asch is trying to get at. Now, it's just a hypothesis, okay? But that was Asch's own interpretation of these kinds of results. Question? Yes, it would. Thank you very much, because that's the second big Asch finding that I want to take you to, and that is what he discovered about order effects in impression formation. Okay, so we're going to answer the question. So here we have another set of 6. Forget about warm and the cold right now. Here we've got an ensemble of 6 traits. One group of subjects sees intelligent first, followed by industrious, impulsive, critical, stubborn, and envious. Another group of subjects sees envious, stubborn, critical, impulsive, and industrious. The same 5 words followed up by intelligent. And again, they're asked to give their impressions. And the finding was that there were order effects on impression formation. The descriptor intelligent had a lot greater impact on people's impressions if it came first in the list, okay, than if it came last in the list. Okay, this is the general order effect in impression formation. And Asch had a theory about this as well. He says, look, what happens is every piece of information that arrives is both shaped by what came before and affects our interpretation of what comes afterward. So the initial stimulus, the initial terms in a trait ensemble set up what Asch called a directed impression. It gets you thinking in a particular direction. The first thing you learn about somebody is that he or she is intelligent, that is going to color everything else that you learn about that person. And these later terms are then interpreted through this first impression. It was Asch who gave us this idea that first impressions tend to stick. And of course, the reason, from a perceptual point of view, that first impressions tend to stick is that the whole point of perception is to form a stable internal mental representation of a stimulus that's constantly in change. Okay, if I'm walking back and forth, which I'm wont to do here, okay, you don't say, oh, geez, he's going over there now he's going over here, now he's coming forward, now he's going back, or whatever. You don't do any of that in perception. You just say Killstrom's lecturing. Okay, the changes are absorbed into the overall stimulus, and that's basically what Asch argued as well. So yes, if warm versus cold came first in the list, it would have an even bigger impression on people's, a bigger effect on people's impressions. These first experiments, the warm-cold experiment and the polite-blunt experiment, he embedded them in the middle of this because that just made sense to him. It was just a choice. Okay, but he understood very clearly that the first impression, the first information that arrives is going to exert an inordinate impact on the final impression, and that's what he tried to model or to simulate in this particular experiment. So here we have 2 big effects. Okay, the first of these is the effect of a central trait. It turns out that all information is not created equal. All trait words are not created equal. Some trait labels or trait terms have a much bigger impact on our impressions than others do. Warm, cold is one such. Actually, intelligent, unintelligent is another one. If you describe somebody as intelligent versus unintelligent, it changes everything in their impression of the person. But that's not the case for any randomly selected bipolar set of words like polite, blunt, or reliable, unreliable, or whatever. So that's the first finding. Okay, and the second finding, which is in a sense kind of consistent with this, is that there are these order effects, so that the first information we get about somebody tends to have a big effect. When your roommate tries to set you up with his sister for a blind date on Friday night, the first thing he's going to do is he's going to say nice things about his sister, right? Well, it's only later you find out that she's psycho or an axe murderer or something like that. And then if he's done his job, he thinks, gee, she's a kind of pretty psycho, you know, or she's a really nice axe murderer. That first impression tends to stick. Okay, the first thing that we heard that we get tends to shape the impression that we have. Again, these are the kinds of findings that are consistent with Asch's general Gestalt approach to the problems of both non-social and social perception. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. There's a unified impression. Okay, that's created that tends to remain kind of stable. Quick question. Yeah. Well, at some point, it's like these presidential candidates. You get an impression of them, right? And then you actually see them through a 15-month election campaign or 12 months of a presidency or something like that. And then you begin, it doesn't say that it sticks forever. It's just hard to change. It takes a lot of information to change. And the reason it takes a lot of information to change is that the early information shapes our perception of the later information. It's all related. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If all you were doing was adding stuff up, okay, you might not get these kinds of order effects. Though next time, I'll show you a series of studies that suggest that you can go a long way just adding stuff up. One more quick question, then we got to go. Yes, it's entirely possible that a lot of this order effect business is mediated by memory. Asch didn't think of that, okay, but he might have. So you can imagine that it's not a perceptual effect, it's order effect, it's really a memory effect. But his point is that whatever it is, it's shaping your total impression of the individual. It's a good question. Okay, we'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you very much.